Good afternoon, everyone. Let me go ahead and introduce myself, if I may. I chair the House Insurance Committee, Representative Hank Zuper. If you don't know where I'm from House District 113, which encompasses probably the most beautiful and majestic city in the United States, Ocean Springs. But having said that, let me start off by thanking each and every one of you, first and foremost, the committee members on both the House and the Senate side. Secondly, my most competent and able Vice Chairman, Kevin Ford. And last but not least, the members of the audience, those who are listening via the internet. I know we have one House member, and more specifically, the speakers. Me and Chairman Michelle understand that all of you are extremely busy. We appreciate you taking the time to come here today and tomorrow to testify. It means a lot to us. And with that being said, let me just, the majority of this hearing is concerning the cost of pharmaceuticals. Ladies and gentlemen, from the perspective of the state health insurance plan, some of you may know this, but over the last 10 years, the cost of pharmaceuticals have increased 60%. Let me repeat that. Over the last 10 years, the cost of pharmaceuticals to the health insurance plan, to the taxpayers and citizens of this state has been 60%. That is unsustainable. We cannot continue down that path. Now, we are here today, and I think I can speak on behalf of the Senate committee. We do not have an agenda. We do not have legislation that we are working on presently for next session. So why are we here? We are here to gather information. We are here, ladies and gentlemen, to allow my colleagues on both the House and the Senate side to pose questions to our speakers. We are here to ascertain information, and we are here once again to get educated, because as policymakers of this great state, we should not be making decisions. We should not be voting on legislation until we have all of the information, until we have all of the statistics and numbers, so that we can promulgate, draft, and vote on good legislation for the taxpayers, the citizens, and the patients of this state. Now, having said that, I can assure you that if we are able to ascertain information and gather statistics and numbers during this meeting and tomorrow's meeting, that where we can reasonably conclude that the legislature has a role to play in this subject matter, I can assure you that the Speaker of the House, Philip Gunn, has given us the green light on the House side to do whatever is in the best interest of the patients and the taxpayers of Mississippi. Chairman Michelle.
On behalf of the Senate Insurance Committee, I'm Walter Michelle, Chairman of the committee. I want to thank everyone for being here. I want to especially thank Chairman Zuber for all the time and effort he's put into lining up a great group of speakers today. We are so busy during the session. It's in the off session that we normally are able to get most of our work done by having the amount of time we can spend on these important issues. And I want to thank Chairman Zuber for being so proactive on this issue that's really increasing the cost of our state health plan. I want to thank you so much for including the members of the Senate Insurance Committee, this informative hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our first guest will be Linda Kahn, and I will allow her representative, Robert Dozier, to introduce her. And just one matter of housekeeping to the members. If you have a question, please get recognized, and don't forget to press your button so where it goes from red to green so that you can be heard. Okay, Mr. Dozier, you're recognized.
Chairman Zuber, thank you for this opportunity. You and Chairman Michelle, members of both committees. As majority of you know, my name is Robert Dozier. I'm the executive director for the Mississippi Independent Pharmacies Association. When I was contacted by Chairman Zuber several months ago concerning this meeting, he asked me to describe how the money flows and what actually goes on in the pharmaceutical drug world. And I told him he needed to speak with someone that had more education about this than I did. So in my research, there are two individuals in this country that I wanted to bring today. One of them is speaking at a national Medicaid conference across the country, and the other one is sitting to my right. Her name is Linda Kahn. Linda is the CEO of Pharmacy Benefit Consultants. What Linda and her company does, they represent the payer, they represent the employer groups, they represent the businesses that are paying the bill for their employees and their beneficiaries. Linda does not represent the pharmacies. Linda will tell you how the pharmacy benefit managers control the majority of and all of the prescription drug world that we have today. Chairman Zuber, it falls in line with what you're talking about, state employees. And one question that everybody needs to leave here today is a question that Senator Dean Kirby asked me a few weeks ago. Why are prescription drugs so high? That's what everybody wants to know. And what is the problem and how do we lower prescription drug costs? And here's the thing, Senator Kirby, in that conversation you and I have had, think about this, the previous 5 or 6 presidential administrations, they've all run on lowering prescription drug costs. Well, what has happened? Same thing what Chairman Zuber just said, prescription drug costs have gone up. The second individual that will be speaking today behind Linda is a practicing pharmacist here in the state of Mississippi by the name of Trey Crawford. Trey will tell you some of the ins and outs that a practicing pharmacist sees on a daily basis and what he thinks can help reduce this cost and or fix problems. And with that said, I will be more than glad to answer any and all questions after these two present, but I think you need to really listen to Ms. Linda Kahn and Mr. Trey Crawford.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I appreciate your time and your attention. I'm going to be walking you through an extremely complex industry, but I am 100% certain that everybody here can understand everything I'm saying, notwithstanding the complexity. So if you stick with me, you'll get the complexity, and putting that aside, if you get the basics, the very basics about the structure of this industry, you'll understand what's going on, and you'll have a good handle on what can be done to change it. And then you can act. I'll go one step further and I'll tell you, we have clients that are very small, like 1,000 life groups, 5,000 life groups, 10,000 life groups. We have clients that are way larger than the Mississippi State Plan. Almost every single one of them has put in place a PBM client contract that saved them somewhere between 20% and 30% of their spend in the first year. So altogether, we have saved clients hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. If your costs go down the first year by 20 to 30%, and then they stay flat and don't go up as much, that means over a 3-year contract, you've basically saved 60%, and your costs have gone up less. So you've basically saved 70% of the total spend that you would have otherwise saved. Right? Because you get the costs were here, you drop them down by 20 to 30%. Then the second year of the contract, your costs would have been up here, but instead they're down here. So by 3 years, you will have saved a bloody fortune. You will make a big difference in your state government expenditures. And notwithstanding that Mississippi is not that large a plan, you can do this. And then I go a step further. Mississippi, these legislators sitting beside me, and the auditor's office and the governor's office can reach out to other states. They can go to Florida, they can go to Texas, they can go to presidential candidates, and they can plant a different conversation that needs to take place. If you folks write a contract that's different for your state, and one of the provisions of that contract is, this contract is not going to be confidential. Any PBM that signs us a contract with us is no longer going to have the right to say the contract is confidential. We're going to do such a good job. We want every provision of the contract being able to be exposed so anybody can copy it. Anybody can copy it. Other states can copy it. Private plans can copy it. Municipal governments can copy it. Now you've spread what you've done to anybody else who wants to copy it. And when they start copying it, you'll change the marketplace. Okay, so the one other thing I want to state as an introduction is, as you're going to see, much of the focus of what I'm talking about has to do with PBMs. PBMs are not, I repeat, not the only reason why drug prices are so high. But as you're going to see, they are at the center of everything. So I'm going to focus on them. I'm also going to focus on them because the state has a contract with PBMs. It doesn't have a contract with manufacturers, with wholesalers, with retail pharmacies, with anybody else. Its contract is with a PBM, right now, Caremark. Its next contract will be with a PBM. So you have to figure out how to write that contract differently. The contract controls your costs. If you don't write it differently, if you end up with the same basic contract that you have right now, stuffed with loopholes, you will not control your contract. You have to basically eliminate all loopholes. Once you do that, you'll control your costs. So an overview of PBMs and how PBMs operate. Let's see, hold on one second. I think I clicked it twice, my apologies, there we go. First, summary of the presentation. I'm going to give you an overview of PBMs and how they operate. I'm going to discuss with you the importance of the PBM client contract. I'm going to then give you 4 examples of core PBM contract terms that allow PBMs to basically make immense sums while increasing plans' costs, including your costs, and patients' costs, and while putting pharmacies out of business. And then I'm going to give you the solutions to those problems. And then I'm going to tell you about additional cutting-edge actions that Mississippi can take that would dramatically decrease your costs, as well as change the entire prescription coverage marketplace. So those are the basic, that's the basic overview of what I'm going to do. I'll mention in terms of point 3, 4 examples. I may not go through all of them. It gets pretty dense, and I don't know that you need to know all 4 examples. And in any event, those 4 examples are 4 examples out of dozens. So it doesn't really matter that you get every single example of every loophole in every PBM contract. What matters is that you get the gist of it, that these contracts are stuffed with loopholes, stuffed. There's not 1, there's not 2, there's typically several dozen core loopholes in contracts. And unless you clean that up, you're not going to control your costs. So first, an overview of PBMs and how PBMs operate. PBM is an acronym for Pharmacy Benefit Manager, or Pharmacy Benefit Manager Company. PBMs create what are called formularies. Those are the lists of covered drugs. So that means PBMs decide which drugs will be covered and which drugs will not be covered. Because PBMs have that power, stop and think about it, they have enormous power over manufacturers. If the PBMs don't include the manufacturer's drug on their formulary, the drug doesn't get sold. PBMs also create programs known as prior authorization, step therapy, quantity limit programs, and others. So a prior authorization program says, you can't take this drug until you get authorization for it. And you can't get authorization until you do to the doctor, until you try another drug first, until you whatever, there's requirements on it. You have to do lab tests. So you can imagine, again, the manufacturers don't want prior authorizations against their drugs. PBMs also create quantity limits on drugs. They say you can't dispense more than X of the drug, or you can dispense as much as 90-day script of the drug. So PBM can say, here's a cancer drug, notwithstanding that we know that the cancer drug may be stopped after 5 days, we're going to let the cancer drug go through in a 90-day script. What does that do? That gives the manufacturer way more market. The manufacturer is going to sell 90 days of cancer drugs that may not be used after 3 or 4 days, or 5 days, or 10 days. So the manufacturer wants a high quantity limit. They want the PBM doing that. What does the state want? The state wants lower quantity limits, especially on something like a cancer drug being dispensed to the first person who's getting it for the first time, because the state is smart enough to know, wait a second, many people start cancer drugs and they can't continue on them. So we don't want it being dispensed in a 90-day quantity. We want it being dispensed in for the first person, for the person taking it for the first time, a 15-day quantity to make sure they stay on it. And then after that, they could get it for 30 days for the next few scripts. And then if it becomes a drug they can take over and over, maybe then we'll let it be dispensed at a higher cost. So your interests are different from the PBMs and the manufacturers. They want to make money off the drugs. You want to control the cost of the drugs and the completely wasteful dispensing of it. So PBMs control formularies and they control these programs. And I've already told you enough to tell you that PBM's interests and manufacturers' interests are different from yours. But they're making those decisions. So PBM's role, as I've just pointed out, in creating formularies and programs gives PBMs immense power over manufacturers. And what you need to know is that PBMs came into existence, I'm now on the last part of my slide here, they came into existence based on the theory that if they aggregated everybody's coverage, so Caremark represents not just the Mississippi state plan, but loads and loads of other plans in Mississippi and every other state, other state governments. If they aggregated all that spend, they would negotiate on your behalf in order to lower your costs. But I've already given you an example of how they're not necessarily acting in your interests, they're acting in their own interests. And I'm going to give you a lot more examples of that as we go through. So here's my master slide of relationships, and I'm going to spend a little time on this so you understand it. As you can see, the PBM is in the center in a big black box. And the reason I put them in a big black box is because they have contracts with every other entity that's in black. Starting on the left side with manufacturers, they have contracts with drug wholesalers, with PBM clients, with retail pharmacies, and with consulting firms. They have contracts with every one of those entities. They know the contents of all those contracts. Every one of those entities needs the PBMs. So every one of those entities has to do basically what the PBMs want it to do. But the PBMs also have their own interests, and those are in red. So the PBMs, the big three PBMs, Caremark, Express Scripts, and Optum, those big three PBMs control somewhere between 75 and 80% of all spend. Okay, all three of those PBMs are subsidiaries of a parent insurance company. That's up in the top in red. That parent insurance company wants to make as much money as they can. So if you enter into a contract with a parent insurance company and you don't have a separate contract with a different PBM, you're asking for trouble. Now you've entered into a single contract with the parent insurance company and the PBM. It probably will have very little terms in it on drugs, and you'll get hosed because you haven't controlled your drug costs. You've just relied on the insurance company, but the insurance company is the parent of the PBM. It's not in their interest to control your costs. It's in their interest to make money off of drugs. So going to the right, the next entity that they have relationships with besides their parent insurance company is PBMs run their own mail order pharmacies. They have huge, big mail order pharmacies that they buy drugs from and that your plan beneficiaries can go to buy drugs from as well. They run their own mail order pharmacies, and then they run their own specialty drug pharmacies. Those specialty drug pharmacies dispense what are known as specialty drugs, extremely high cost drugs, drugs that cost $2,000 per 30-day script, $10,000 per 30-day scripts, $150,000 per 30-day script. Those are the specialty drugs. The PBMs have their own pharmacies. They buy those drugs cheap from the wholesalers or from the manufacturers, and then they're selling them to your plan beneficiaries. So what's in their interest? Is there an interest to sell it to you at the lowest cost possible? Or is their interest to buy it cheap and then sell it more expensively? Obviously, it's the latter. They have their own specialty drug pharmacies selling these extremely high cost drugs. If you don't write a contract that controls the price that they can sell those specialty drugs at, you're in trouble. And I will tell you that every contract we have ever seen, my firm has ever seen, and I have seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of PBM client contracts. There's not a single contract that controls the price of specialty drugs dispensed from PBM specialty drug pharmacies. And I'll show you why later on. Okay, they have an obvious contract, obvious conflict of interest. They're the PBM, they have a subsidiary specialty drug pharmacy. They want to make as much money as they can. They're buying the drugs from the wholesalers at low costs, lower costs. And then the contracts let them essentially sell the drugs to the Mississippi State Plan and everybody else they're dealing with at basically whatever cost they want. So they can make huge spreads on these drugs. If you don't get a contract that pins down for every specialty drug dispensed through the specialty pharmacy, a low cost, and I'll tell you how to do it, you're in trouble. So that's most PBMs. They have their own mail order pharmacies, their own specialty drug pharmacies. Caremark has another layer on this, which is Caremark has its own retail pharmacies. They have CVS as a subsidiary entity with all the CVS pharmacies. So they obviously want to sell more drugs through CVS pharmacies. The PBM, which is the parent company to the retail CVS pharmacies, wants to sell those drugs at as high cost as they can. There's an obvious conflict. You want your members buying them at as low cost as they can, but they have a subsidiary retail pharmacy relationship with CVS. So Caremark has its own mail order pharmacy, its own specialty drug pharmacy, and its own retail pharmacies. And you're trying to get them to sell as low as they can, but they have an interest in charging you as much as they can. If you don't write the contract with Caremark to control retail, mail, and specialty drugs, you're going to get hosed on all of them. And then finally, over on the left, I've got in red PBM's affiliated rebate aggregators. So there are rebate rearrangements where after the drug is dispensed, the manufacturer pays rebates to the PBM through these what are called rebate aggregators. And the rebate aggregators are related to the PBMs. They're subsidiaries of the PBMs. So again, there's a conflict of interest, and I'm going to explain to you during the presentation just how that conflict works. The bottom line about this slide is the following. Well, I missed one part. I've got consulting firms in green down at the corner. So PBMs also enter into contracts with consulting firms. I had, when I first opened up my firm back in 2005, within weeks after opening my firm up, and it was a very little firm at that point, it's still a little firm, I had PBMs calling me, wanting to quote unquote, establish a relationship. And when I said to them, what exactly does that mean? They said to me, well, you're going to conduct RFPs. We know you've already started an RFP. If you will feed the business to us, we'll pay you a per member per month fee. The first time I got offered money, it was for a very small contract from a very small PBM. I was going to make $1.5 million per year on that small contract if I fed the business to the small PBM. Okay? I'm a small firm. I had just opened up business. I could have made like that, $1.5 million by feeding the business to a small PBM. There are relationships between PBMs and consulting firms. If the state of Mississippi wants to make sure that the consulting firm that it's relying on is acting in its interests and isn't in a relationship with the PBM, the state of Mississippi must insist that it get a conflict of interest disclosure form, and it must have a penalty clause in it. Don't just get a disclosure form, because if it's just a disclosure form without a penalty clause, then the consulting firms can all just lie about what their financial relationships are. If there's a penalty clause that says, here's your liquidated damages, folks. If you, the consulting firm, don't disclose all your financial relationships with every vendor in a list, and we find out you didn't disclose them later on, you're not only going to reimburse us what we paid you, you're going to pay us a liquidated damages penalty clause. And then the state should name a very big number, because you're relying on that consulting firm to help you save hundreds of millions of dollars. And if they don't do their job, you're not going to save that money. And if they don't do their job because they're in bed with the PBMs that they fed the business to, and they didn't write a contract that controls your costs, they should have to reimburse you. So if you have a conflict of interest disclosure form with a big penalty, liquidated damages penalty clause, I'm sure there's lawyers in the room here, put a big number on it, 50 million, 100 million. You should, if I were the consulting firm you were thinking about hiring, make me sign the conflict form. Find out whether I have conflicts. Make me say, if I'm lying to you, I'll be willing to pay you $50 million. And make every other consulting firm you're considering sign that form before you hire them. And to the extent the state already has consulting firms in place, which I know you do, the state can pass legislation which says every consulting firm we hire related to any healthcare or any prescription drug coverage contract must sign a conflict form. It must require the entity to disclose all relationships with any related vendors, and it must contain a steep liquidated damages penalty clause. When you do that, you'll find out who will sign the forms, and you'll find out that many of the consulting firms that you may be relying on right now, or that you may be considering downstream for an RFP process or for anything else, you'll find out they're conflicted. And if they're conflicted, you shouldn't be using them. And by the way, if you do that and you encourage other states and all plans in your state to do the same thing, you will essentially change this relationship that exists between PBMs and consulting firms. They'll have to stop paying off the consulting firms to feed them business, right? So one other major overview slide is there's another huge problem in the industry. This is also rather in the weeds, but I think you'll get it. The problem is the metric for the pricing that's being used. So I'm going to run through a few of these, and you're going to see that the metrics are all dreadful. So first is wholesale acquisition cost. It's not the wholesale cost, it's not the acquisition, and it's not the cost. It's called WAC in the industry, wholesale acquisition cost. What is it? It's a completely made up number that the manufacturers place on their drug when they sell it. Okay? It's known as WAC. They make it up. They don't necessarily sell it to the wholesalers or sell it to the PBMs at that drug. It's just the quote unquote list price of the drug. And it can be anything they want because it's just made up. And needless to say, it's getting higher and higher, the WACs. The WAC price is used by PBMs when they're negotiating with the manufacturers. That WAC price is substantially lower than the next one, AWP, average wholesale price. AWP is not the average price, not the wholesale, and not the price. It's also made up. It's made up by national reporting services. It's higher than WAC by about 16% typically. So the PBMs, when they're writing contracts with state plans and with everybody else, they use AWP and give discounts off of AWP, but that's based off of the manufacturer's list price with an additional 16% tacked on. So again, those are two metrics that have nothing to do with reality, nothing to do with the cost of manufacturing the drug, nothing to do with anything other than a made up price with a 16% add-on. And then there's something called MAC, M-A-C, which the PBMs also invent. It's called the maximum allowable cost, which makes you think in your brain, well, that's good, it's a maximum cost, except for the PBMs are creating MACs and changing MACs literally every week for every contract. So it's just a movable number that they use to reimburse pharmacies. And the pharmacies are at the mercy of the PBM's MAC pricing. And so are you, because you have MAC terms in your contract. So I'm going to skip the next three and get down to the bottom, which is NADAC. NADAC in blue is the national average drug acquisition cost. That's an actual real number. It's not made up. It's a survey. It's taken from a survey of retail pharmacies, which the retail pharmacies respond to saying, here's what we bought our drugs for. We, the retail pharmacies, paid this much money to buy our drug from wholesalers. So that's a real number. So if the state wants to change its structure and get away from WAC and AWP and MAC, which are all totally made up and totally changing all the time, the state could put in a requirement for its state contract that it has to be based on NADAC, the one on the bottom, because that's a real number. It's the real cost that the retail pharmacies are paying to buy their drugs. It's not made up. So if the PBM had to reimburse the retail pharmacies using the cost of their drugs at their actual acquisition cost, and then paid the retail pharmacies a dispensing fee for each script dispensed, then you would know you were getting the cost at a reasonable cost. You'd be getting NADAC. And then you would have to be invoiced based on that NADAC. Now, instead of being invoiced based on fictitious WAC and AWP prices, you're being invoiced based on the actual acquisition cost by the retail pharmacies. So bottom line, core conclusion about PBMs. PBMs know the terms of every contract in their web of contracts, but PBMs keep every contract confidential. Therefore, no one else knows the terms of any contract but them. Okay, the retail pharmacy knows its contract with the PBM. It doesn't know what the other retail pharmacies have. It doesn't know any of the other terms. The manufacturer knows its contract with the PBM. It doesn't know what the other manufacturers have. It doesn't know any of the other terms. You, as a client state, you know your contract terms, but the PBM says to you when you're signing your contract, I guarantee you, your Caremark contract has a provision in it saying that it's totally confidential and it cannot be disclosed. As I said, the next contract you sign should not have a confidentiality provision in it. It should say, our contract will be entirely disclosed to the public. You, the PBM, have to be willing to let us disclose it. So they know the terms of every contract. No one else knows the terms of any contract. They're in a big black box controlling everything, making money off of all those internal relationships that they have with their own affiliates, making sure that they price everything so their affiliates can make money and not paying attention to their requirement that they act as a fiduciary to you, the state, and to any other plan. So PBMs claim, and the plans assume, that the PBMs are operating in the plan's interests. However, the PBMs have numerous financial conflicts of interest, and they pursue their own interests, not yours. Okay, and then the final point, of course, is that they can manipulate the pricing metrics, the WAC, the AWP, the MAC. They couldn't manipulate NADAC because NADAC is NADAC. It's published by the federal government. Every week, there's a new NADACs that come out. That can't be manipulated, but all the other metrics they're using can be easily manipulated. Okay, so the importance of the PBM client contract. Most PBM client contracts, as I said, are stuffed with loopholes. There are dozens and dozens of them. These loopholes make virtually every pricing term and guarantee meaningless. I put virtually in a parentheses because I haven't seen every contract on the market, but I will tell you that every contract I've ever seen, and I've seen hundreds of them, all the guarantees and pricing terms are meaningless. They're worthless. To change the situation and control your costs, a PBM client, including Mississippi State, has to eliminate the loopholes in the contract. If you don't do that, you're not going to control your costs. So a plan like Mississippi can obtain a loophole-free contract. I've told you we're getting them for our clients. You can certainly get them for the state, but you have to bid out an RFP, and you have to, in that RFP, focus the RFP on the contract. You have to write your own contract, make it totally different, eliminate the loopholes, and then see which PBMs will play ball. There will be PBMs that want your business and will give you a loophole-free contract. And then to really change the marketplace, you need to do some other core things, which I'm going to tell you about. So this slide just goes over the fact that in order to get that contract, you have to use an RFP, and the RFP's leverage to get the contract. So now I'm going to give you several examples of contract terms that are examples of loopholes, and you'll get them right away. I'm not going to go through all of them. I think I'll glaze you all over. If you get just a few of them, you'll get the point. And you just know that there's not just these few, there's dozens just like this. So let me give you one of the biggest ones. I'm going to start with ambiguous contract definitions. So here's my best example of why definitions in a contract matter and how the poor definitions in your contract mean there's not a single pricing term or guarantee that works in your contract that actually controls costs. So here's my analogy. Suppose you went to a grocery store and on the grocery store window was a fish guarantee. And the guarantee said what I have in red: all fish, asterisk, 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 guaranteed to be no more than $7.95 per pound. And then the asterisk took you down to a footnote at the bottom of the ad, and it said, grocery reserves the right to exclude certain fish from the fish guarantee in the grocery's discretion. Now, how good is that guarantee? The answer to that question is it's worthless. Why is it worthless? Because of the definition for fish. That definition means that for the really cheap fish like tilapia and cod that might cost the grocery $2.95 or $3.95, they can keep the fish in the guarantee and charge you up to $7.95 per pound, right? The definition of fish also means that they can exclude any fish they want from the guarantee. So all the fish you really want to get cheaply, the salmon, the Chilean sea bass, that you're now paying $14 or $15 or $30 for, they can exclude it from the guarantee and charge you whatever they want. So they can charge much more for the cheap fish and exclude the expensive fish from the guarantee, right? Now, if you conduct an RFP and the consulting firm, the grocery store consulting firm says to you, I'm going to save you lots of money. I'm going to get the fish guarantee from $7.95 per pound down to $5.95 per pound. Will they save you any money? If it's still fish, asterisk, the grocery store gets to remove any fish it wants from the guarantee? Obviously not. The grocery can still charge 30 or 40 or 50 bucks for Chilean sea bass, right? The fact that you got the guarantee down from $7.95 to $5.95 isn't going to help you. The definition for fish has to be cleaned up. Your fish definition has to say every fish in the marketplace, including the following, must be included in the guarantee. And then you have to get all the groceries to compete with that pinned down definition, and now you'll save money for fish. As long as you have a bad definition for fish with that the groceries can manipulate, you're not going to control your costs. Does everybody get that? Yes? Okay, that's the problem in your contract. I will guarantee you, if I could see your Caremark contract, and if you get another PBM contract that's the same, if you don't pin down the important definitions so that it's very clear what goes in the guarantees, you're not going to control your costs. They'll take out, the PBMs will take out certain drugs and then charge you whatever they want for those drugs. Or they'll switch the brands over to the generic category or the generics over to the brand category and charge you whatever they want for those drugs. So here's why that's happening. Every PBM contract contains definitions and every PBM contract has guarantees in it, but every guarantee is worthless because the definitions are fishy. None of them are pinned down. So the PBM can basically carve out drugs from the guarantee and charge whatever they want for those carved out drugs. You following me? So the guarantees in a contract, they're based on retail brand drugs, retail 90 brand drugs, retail generic drugs, retail 90 generic drugs, mail brand and generic drugs, and specialty drugs. The key terms are brand drug, generic drug, specialty drug. Every guarantee has one of those three terms in it in your contract. Every guarantee has one of those three terms. If those terms are fishy, they're not pinned down, the guarantee is worthless. The guarantees can go from AWP minus 18 to AWP minus 30, minus 50, it doesn't matter because they can carve out drugs because you don't have a pinned down definition. And that's exactly what's going on. Every guarantee in your current contract, I've never seen it, I will put money on it, a lot of money. Every guarantee is written with a fishy definition of brand drug, generic drug, and specialty drug. So here's some examples of fishy definitions. Brand drug means all drugs in First Databank's national drug file or another nationally recognized drug source designated by the PBM. So you think to yourself, well, that must be good. It's referencing First Databank. The problem is First Databank doesn't define what's a brand drug. It's a reference to nothing. It's a reference to meaninglessness. It's a reference to the fact that the PBM is going to get to define what's a brand drug. Here's another one that's in thousands of contracts across the country. One of the big PBMs uses this. PBM uses its own proprietary algorithm to classify brand drugs. Does that pin down what's a brand drug? When you get a brand drug discount guarantee of AWP minus 18% for retail drugs, does that pin it down? We're going to use their own proprietary algorithm, just like the grocery store does. It has a proprietary algorithm. It carves out all Chilean sea bass, all salmon, all whatever it wants, and charges whatever it wants for it. The PBM uses its own proprietary algorithm. Its proprietary algorithm says the following 100 drugs aren't brand drugs. We're going to call them something else. And then when the auditor comes in to see if the guarantee was satisfied, none of those drugs are going to be included in the guarantee. Specialty drug definition at the bottom of the page. I told you your contract undoubtedly has specialty drug guarantees. Here's a specialty drug definition that's fishy. It doesn't pin down what's a specialty drug at the bottom. Specialty drug means any drug that may be a high-cost drug or may be a drug that requires special handling. Okay, if there's a lawyer in this room or lawyers, they know a definition that says may be is not a definition. It's whatever the PBM wants. It may be that, or it may not be that. So that doesn't pin down what's a specialty drug. Now, if you have a guarantee that says all specialty drugs across the year will satisfy a guarantee of AWP minus 18%, you're just going to carve out lots of specialty drugs and charge whatever they want for them. Just the way the grocery store can charge whatever they want for Chilean sea bass. You have to pin down what specialty drugs are going to be. So our suggestion is create a list of every specialty drug. There's about 1,600 of them, and get a drug by drug guarantee for every one of those drugs. Now you're controlling specialty drug costs. Okay, I have a cross-reference definition. Every specialty drug, here's what a definition of specialty drugs is. It's the list that I just created and any drug that's a new to market that I, the state, want to add to the list. Now I have a pinned down definition, and now my guarantee is going to be a drug by drug guarantee for every specialty drug. Okay, and then you're going to make that drug by drug guarantee low. You're going to say for any drug that has a NADAC, that's what the drug cost has to be. You can't charge me $10,000 for a specialty drug if the NADAC is $300. And by the way, that's exactly what the PBMs are doing often. You have to charge me NADAC. If the drug doesn't have a NADAC, here's what you have to do as a satisfaction of the guarantee. And then you have to rely on a consulting firm that knows available pricing and puts in strong guarantees. Okay, so this is an example of a strong brand drug definition. As you can see, it's very pinned down, very defined. I won't go through the details of it. Here's another problem with PBM contracts, a second problem, pass-through pricing versus spread pricing. So most clients, including the state of Mississippi, undoubtedly think they have pass-through pricing, but they undoubtedly do not. So what is pass-through pricing? I've drawn a picture of it. Pass-through pricing means the PBM pays for drugs at one very low cost. That's on the left side of the screen. And then they invoice the client at a much higher cost. Okay, so there's a spread, an unknown spread, profit spread that the PBM is taking. You can't find out what the PBM is actually paying for the drug. If it's a retail pharmacy reimbursement, you can't find out what they reimburse the retail pharmacy. If it's the PBM's mail order or specialty drug pharmacy where they're buying the drugs, you can't find out what they bought the drug for. Okay? They won't tell you. They'll just tell you your invoiced cost. If you want to control your costs, you've got to get them to tell you their actual payment or their actual acquisition cost, and then you've got to have your contract say, invoice us based on that cost. That would be pass-through pricing. So here's a picture of pass-through pricing. On the left side, what the PBM paid for the drug. If it's their own mail order pharmacy or their own specialty pharmacy, it's what they acquired the drug for. It's not a negotiated rate between the PBM and their pharmacy. It's what they acquired the drug for. And then they have to pass through that price to you. They're not making any profit spread on it. And then they're going to charge you an admin fee. Okay? And the way you get your admin fee low is in the RFP, you get the PBMs to compete. Who will dispense these drugs at the lowest admin fee? You say, we're going to write a contract, we're going to insist on pass-through pricing. The pass-through pricing has to be real pass-through pricing. It has to include the PBM's mail order pharmacy and the PBM's specialty pharmacy. And for those pharmacies, it has to require the PBM to give you their acquisition cost. Not a negotiated rate between the PBM and their pharmacy. Obviously, that can be anything they want. They have to not pass through their negotiated rates. They have to pass through their acquisition costs. You require a contract like that, and then you insist that you're only going to do business with the PBM that will give you their acquisition costs. And then you have audit terms, which lets you audit their acquisition costs. And then you get the PBMs to compete on who will give you the lowest admin fee. Now you will control your costs. This is, by the way, this is just a quick slide. It shows you how PBMs are end running pass-through pricing for retail drugs. It addresses an issue called pharmacy clawbacks, which are putting retail pharmacies out of business. So it's another end run around pass-through pricing. So let's say your contract says, which it probably does, for retail drugs, Caremark will invoice the state exactly what it reimbursed the retail pharmacies. Okay, so it reimburses the retail pharmacies 2 weeks after or 4 weeks after the drug is dispensed. But suppose the PBM then claws back money from the retail pharmacy 3 months or 6 months later. If they're clawing back money and that clawback isn't included in your pass-through pricing because you didn't write the contract to either ban clawbacks or include clawbacks in the pass-through pricing, then you're not getting pass-through pricing. You're getting a pass-through of the initial invoiced costs, but then the PBM is clawing back money from the pharmacy. So the graph at the bottom shows how much pharmacy clawbacks have grown in the Medicare program, okay? They started in 2013 at about $200 million. According to analyses that are done, retail pharmacy clawbacks for the Medicare program are now at $9.1 billion. So after the drugs are dispensed in Medicare, after all of the invoicing takes place, the PBMs are clawing back money from the retail pharmacies to the tune of $9.1 billion in Medicare. Those clawbacks mean the government is getting overcharged. They also mean that the retail pharmacies are going to go out of business because the PBMs are free to claw back as much money as they want, and they are. And as you know, a PBM like Caremark, which has its own retail pharmacies as a subsidiary, they will love to claw back money from independent pharmacies because if they put them out of business, CVS Pharmacies is in better shape. The more independents they put out of business, the better off CVS Pharmacies is. So this summarizes the retail pharmacy clawback game. This explains an end run around mail and specialty drug pass-through pricing. And this describes the solutions to the pass-through pricing game. Plans like your plan have to draft and insist on a PBM contract that requires the PBMs to provide pass-through pricing for every drug, whether dispensed through retail, Retail 90, mail, or specialty drug pharmacies. The contracts have to ensure that there are no end runs around the pass-through pricing provision. The contracts have to also include explicit provisions requiring audits so that you can audit it and make sure you're actually getting pass-through pricing. And then the contracts have to include penalty clauses, because if you audit and you discover they didn't do it and they just have to pay you what they would have paid you in the first place, that won't disincentivize them. It has to say, if we audit and we find a problem, you're going to pay us 3 times the amount you owe us. Now they have an incentive to do it right.
Linda,
Yeah.
I hate to interrupt you, but we want to make sure you have some time to answer some questions. So how much more time do you need for your?
What I'm going to do is I'm going to skip ahead, if I can, and not go through all the contract loopholes. There's a lot more. And I'm going to skip ahead to some additional, what I call cutting edge solutions, which I think you'll be interested in.
Can you finish that in 5 minutes, please?
I will.
Thank you.
Yep. So if the marketplace is going to work, 2 things have to be possible. One is you have to have price information. You have to know the actual price of a drug. It can't be floating around. It can't change day to day. It can't be unknown. You have to know the actual price. If you go into Costco, you see the price of the drug. You see, the price of the computer, or the price of the product on the shelf. You can compare prices. In the drug world, you can't do that. And part of the reason you can't do it is because of rebates. They're lowering the cost of the drug, but you can't see them. The other thing you have to do is you have to know the value of the product. And in drugs, the value of the product is the efficacy side effect information. So here's what I would urge you to do. You need to create price competition. Your contract can create price competition for drugs. And here's how you would do it. You wrest control from the PBM and you say, in every therapeutic category where there are multiple interchangeable drugs, for instance, insulin drugs, there's 3 manufacturers, all of whom make insulin. All of the insulin is the same. No manufacturer's insulin is any better than the other manufacturer's insulin. But you don't actually know the price of insulin right now, because there's the insulin price, then there's an unknown rebate, then there's an unknown discount, and you get invoiced every time you get an invoice for insulin, and it doesn't have the rebate in it. So you don't know the price of insulin, neither do your beneficiaries. The PBM knows it, but you don't. So how could you know it, and how could you force the prices to come down? You, the state, should have the right in your contract to go to the 3 insulin manufacturers and say to them, we're going to state a date. September 1st at 9 a.m. is our bid day for insulin. You, the manufacturers, have a choice. We don't want any more rebates. We don't want any more secret payments to PBMs. You, the manufacturers, tell us at 9 a.m. on September 1st through an electronic transmission what you'll sell us insulin for. That's the price we're going to publish. Whichever one of you manufacturers gives us the lowest cost for insulin, you're going to get all of our insulin sold. You're the manufacturer that's going to sell insulin to all of our beneficiaries. Now you have the bid day competition. They all submit their price. You pick the lowest manufacturer's price and you publish it for the whole world to see. Okay? 3 months or 6 months later, you have a second bid day and you go to the 3 manufacturers again. And you say, we're running another bid day. Which one of you wants to win? Everybody already knows what insulin was sold at the last time. You published it. So now the 2 manufacturers that lost the competition, those 2 manufacturers have to underbid the price, right? So they're going to reduce their costs below the lowest cost. The lowest cost manufacturer is going to reduce his price more, right? Because he wants to hold on to the marketplace. So you're creating price competition. The price of insulin will plummet. If you were to do that and you were to publish your contract and others copied that, you would create price competition in numerous therapeutic categories. You would lower the cost of insulin for your own plan, others would copy you, and then you would lower the cost of insulin across the marketplace. Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Linda. Before we take questions, and let's keep Ms. Linda up there before we hear from the second speaker for questions. But before we take questions, Ms. Linda, can you make sure that the members of the committee get a hard copy of your presentation, please? Okay. And if you don't mind, do you mind taking some questions? Okay, we'll go ahead and open the floor up for questions. Senator, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. How often did you say that NADAC prices are updated? They updated weekly?
Every week.
Every week. So every week there's a fresh set of prices on drugs.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Linda, I have a question. What other states have a completely public contract like you mentioned?
None.
I'm
You
sorry?
could be the first. None.
Mississippi would be the first, okay. Is
There
there,
are PBMs that will do that, by the way. They want your business. The smaller PBMs would love your business. 300,000 covered lives is a lot of lives. They would love to get your contract business.
can you specify one for this committee, please?
I'd rather not do that publicly. I don't think it's appropriate.
Okay, what is in place to reduce the cost that the manufacturer charges, if anything?
So I didn't go through that part of the production of the presentation, sorry. But there's a two-step dance going on between manufacturers and PBMs. As I said, the manufacturers have to get on the PBM's formularies, and they have to get those programs, the prior authorization, step therapy, and quantitative programs favoring their drugs. So in order to get on the formularies and in order to get those programs favoring their drugs, they do what the PBMs dictate. And what do the PBMs dictate? They want two things. One, they want a rebate, and they'll pass the rebate through to you. Two, they want other money that they collect that they don't pass through, that's labeled with other names. That's money the PBMs keep for themselves. So there's two buckets. There's the rebates that are going to go back to the plans, and then there's the other monies called administrative fees, purchase discounts, health management fees, data sales fees. There's all kinds of names for them. When we were litigating against Medco, there were 35 different names for other money that was being collected. Okay, 35 different names for the money the PBM was collecting from the manufacturers that never got passed through. So the two-step dance is the manufacturers have to get on the formularies and have to have the programs favoring them. So they do what the PBMs want them to do in order to have that happen. And obviously the largest manufacturers are in a better position to do that, right? Because they have more drugs, they're bigger players, they can do more what the PBMs demand because they're bigger, right? So once they've done that, they look and they say, well, our list price of the drug is $5,000 per script, but the PBM just demanded back $2,000 in rebates and $2,000 in other payments. So we're actually only going to make $1,000. So what are we going to do? Here's dance step number 2. We'll raise the price of our drug to make up for it. So who started this game? I don't know, but the game is easy. The game is, here's the list price. PBMs demand money to reduce the price, some of which they're pocketing. Manufacturers take the second step, raise their price. PBMs then demand more money. Manufacturers then raise their price. PBMs then demand more money. Manufacturers then raise the price. So the two-step dance that the PBMs are doing are over and over and over again, increasing the list prices of drugs.
Senator, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We hear a lot about, we all know our rising costs of drugs here in the States. We also hear Canada and Europe has a lot cheaper drugs, same drug, just cheaper cost to it. Do they utilize PBMs? And if not, is that why their drug costs are so low?
Most of the foreign countries do not use PBMs. They have a national government agency, like for instance, England has something called NICE, N-I-C-E, the National Institute of something or another. Australia has a government agency. They're basically negotiating prices or they're fixing prices with the PBMs. Sorry, with the manufacturers. So they don't have an intermediary PBM. They have a government organization fixing prices. If you want my opinion, you could, that's where we're headed. You know, we are definitely headed towards a system where we're going to try to get governments more and more to fix prices. That will fix the prices at a price, but it won't create price competition. So you may get the prices lower than they are right now. But in my view, you're much better off creating price competition. In America, the greatest country in the world for sure, we have flourished because we've had competitive marketplaces where we force entities to compete. In my opinion, if you you could fix the price of insulin, or you could create price competition and drive the price of insulin down lower and lower and lower and lower. I would argue for price competition, not fixing prices. And in any event, the state of Mississippi can't fix prices, right? They just can't.
Representative, you recognized.
Oh, go back to the clawbacks for a moment. How do they justify that and what is a way to stop that?
They can justify it in any number of ways, and they do. They claim they're correcting errors that were made in the reimbursement to the pharmacy. They claim that the pharmacy hasn't satisfied certain dispensing arrangements, so they want 90% of generics going through, and the pharmacy purportedly only had 80% of generics going through. Of course, the pharmacy doesn't control how many generic drugs it dispenses, so that's pretty phony. But they can make up whatever they want and just claw back money. I didn't go through the full slide, but the current analyses are they're clawing back roughly 1 to 11% of the total list price of the drug in clawbacks. And you saw the number of Medicare clawbacks. It's $9 billion now. So they're getting huge. What's the way to fix it? Ban clawbacks and then put in place audit provisions where you can actually audit the arrangement. Okay? And you can audit it both on the PBM side and on the pharmacy side. So they have to turn over the tapes of the reimbursements and the post-reimbursement adjustments to the pharmacies. There shouldn't be clawbacks.
Okay, Ms. Linda, we're going to speed it up. We got 4 colleagues that have questions. Mr. Vice Chairman.
Not so much a question. Thank you for being here. Senator Mike McLendon from DeSoto County. And I've gotten permission to use these 2 pharmacies' names. Both are in Hernando, and the clawback number for 2021 for Funderburk's Pharmacy was 113,766. And for Louis' Pharmacy is 82,000 and some change. If that money's not going to our local communities, where does it go?
The PBM's keeping it. The PBM claws it back from the pharmacy after they've invoiced you. So they claim they're giving you pass-through pricing, but they're not. They're passing through the initial reimbursement cost to the pharmacy, and then they claw more money back. So you're not getting the actual acquisition cost. You're getting the acquisition cost, the first acquisition cost, and then they're clawing money back. If they pass that through to you, you would get lower costs. But the better solution there is to stop the clawbacks because they're putting the pharmacies out of business. And the pharmacies, I didn't emphasize this, but pharmacies, just like manufacturers, every player has to have the PBMs. If a pharmacy says, I'm not doing business with you, Caremark, the pharmacy will go out of business. Caremark, Optum, and Express Scripts have 75 to 80% of all scripts in the country.
And this is something the legislature can do on a state level.
Absolutely.
Thank you, ma'am.
Senator from Madison, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Did I understand you to say in response to the chairman's question that there's no state that has negotiated with the PBM?
No, every state is negotiating with the PBMs. The question was, is any state contract entirely public? And the answer is no. I'll tell you that every state says that its contracts are public, but the contract provisions allow the PBM to redact portions of it. And they redact all the meat of the contract that shows the loopholes.
Okay, so I guess a follow-up to that then is, are there states that have negotiated with their PBMs to have the pass-through language for the actual cost, to have the no clawback language?
I haven't seen every state contract, so I couldn't answer that question, but I would tell you, based on the ones I've seen, that no state has a good contract in place.
No state.
No.
Thank you.
Senator from Lafayette.
Thank you. I want to follow up on the clawbacks and just to follow up a little bit to what Senator Blackman asked and what Chairman Zuber suggested. On the clawbacks, you suggested that we put into place a no clawbacks provision, and I definitely can understand the merit to this. How common is that in contracts right now? Okay.
I lost the end of your sentence.
Okay. How common is it to see a no clawbacks clause in these contracts right now?
Almost no contract I've ever seen has anything about clawbacks, anything.
Thank you.
Senator from Rankin.
Rankin, you said gentleman. Did you say gentleman from Rankin? I'm not used to being called a gentleman, so thank you. Couple of quick questions. One, when you first opened up, you said, I'd like to tell you the good, the bad, the advantages and disadvantages of a PBM. I'm still waiting for the advantages. Did you not say that in the beginning? I thought you said.
PBMs were put in place to aggregate all the spend and then use their leverage to act on behalf of all of the payers, meaning you, and on behalf of the patients, meaning your beneficiaries. That's why they came into existence. It very, very soon got corrupted because, as I showed you, all those little parts in red are their own interests. They've got their own pharmacies, retail, mail, and specialty. They've got relationships with consulting firms. They've got their own relationships with rebate aggregators. So in every one of those instances, they act on their own behalf, not your behalf.
Okay, one other thing I read recently where there's an independent pharmacy that opened a drugstore next door to his drugstore for cash only, without insurance, and was saving people a lot of money because they could buy drugs a lot less than what it would cost them with insurance.
That's correct.
And if people only carried insurance for their hospitalization and their doctors, no, not drugs. Is that going to be common?
Well, the problem with doing that is that works for low-cost drugs. But when you get to the high-cost drugs, if you don't put it through insurance, you're not, so to speak, getting credit for it against your maximum out-of-pocket cost, right? So you may get it at a lower cost, but what every patient is trying to do is hit that maximum out-of-pocket cost limit, so they're not liable for any cost. So any sick person who's going to run up thousands or tens of thousands of dollars of bills wants to put all their costs through their insurance plan, because that will get them to hit the out-of-pocket cap quicker, right? So you don't want to be buying it in an uninsured position.
And I understand that, but that particular person gave an example of like a $300 drug that he bought next door for $12.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, two more questions. Representative from Hines.
Okay, thank you. Got the green button on. Lady, thank you for your presentation. And just a couple of things to just educate me on the PBM. But in Mississippi, the PBMs are regulated by the Pharmacy Board, or who regulates them? Whose jurisdiction they come under?
I don't know what the Mississippi laws are. You can probably ask the Mississippi folks that question.
Board of Pharmacy, okay. And most states, I'm hearing that some of them come on Board of Insurance. I'm not trying to get ahead, Mr. Chairman, but I'm just trying to get this in. But y'all can learn more about this presentation, what you're telling us. So maybe I should hold my questions for you. Okay, I hope.
Okay,
Thank
thank you.
you.
Last question, Senator from Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I know, Ms. Khan, you're advocating to get rid of clawbacks, but I've still hung up on the response to the question from Representative Newman that you said they just make up things. Is there not a contract between, I'm still stuck with that. Is there there should be a contract between the PBM and the pharmacy and or the state that would say these are the terms upon which you could get the clawback. And I'm confused as to how they could just make up categories to pull money back for themselves.
So the problem is the following. In my master chart that I showed you at the beginning with all of the players, as I said, every player needs the PBMs. Okay, the manufacturers need them to get on the formularies. The wholesalers need them because they're selling drugs to the PBM specialty and mail order pharmacies. The retail pharmacies need them because to the extent the retail pharmacy pulls out entirely and says, I'm not dispensing through you Caremark anymore. So they can't pull out. So what's happening, especially to the independent pharmacies, they're basically in what lawyers call an adhesion contract position. So an adhesion contract is take it or leave it, right? Here's the contract. You want to be part of our pharmacy network, says Caremark or Optum or Express Script. Here's the contract. Sign it or get lost. That's basically the position the pharmacies are in. Okay? So the clawback provisions, they're not in there. They just are allowed to pull money back and they pull back what they want. And the pharmacies can't do anything about it. And I'll give you a final example of just how powerful the PBMs are. Years ago, one of the big PBMs got into a battle, not with a little mom and pop independent, but with Walgreens. They were trying to dictate certain things to Walgreens, and Walgreens said, no, we've had it. We're not doing it. And so the PBM said, you're out of our network. We'll just use Caremark. And what happened? Walgreens caved in very soon thereafter. They could not afford not to. Walgreens, which has 7,000 plus pharmacies across the country, not a little independent mom and pop, but Walgreens, they caved. They did what the PBM wanted. So the PBMs play CVS pharmacies against Walgreens, and they try to get each of those huge chains. And if you brought in a representative from Costco or from Walmart, they would tell you the terms of their contracts are being dictated. Either they play ball or they lose all that business. And one of the reasons they can't afford to lose the business is the pharmacies, all of them, want people coming in to get the drugs, so they buy stuff, hair shampoo, combs, beach balls, whatever, from the front end of the pharmacy. They cannot afford to not be part of the network.
Ms. Linda, thank you so much for your presentation. We know you're extremely busy and we appreciate your time and your presentation. Robert, you have a second person you would like to testify? That's all he has.
The last side about the incident. As Robert said earlier, I'm Trey Crawford. As I said earlier, I'm Trey Crawford, and it's gonna be hard for me to stand up here and speak and not walk around, so I apologize. I am a former pharmacy owner in the state of Mississippi. I see Representative Scott here from Laurel. I owned and operated a drugstore there for 12 years that I hold near and dear to my heart. Excuse me, I've got a cough and I apologize. Before I get going on sort of what I wanted to talk about, I wanted to answer your question a little bit differently. And in your question, you said Funderburks. That's Ms. Cheryl Sudduth up there. Very, very good pharmacist up there. You asked a question, you said she had $118,000 in DR fees. It's very common, very, very common. But you asked a question, what are clawbacks is what you guys were talking about. DR fees are a portion of clawbacks. There's several different kinds of clawbacks, but DR is what you're talking about in general. Usually does not happen in state government. All that stuff goes through Medicare Part D. Now, you guys, I'm assuming, help with your retirees, so you may do something with that. But DIR fees are directly related to Medicare Part D. You asked what they were and what they are for. In the original law, what it was for was to reduce premiums for Medicare Part D patients. And she said, and I'm not correcting you at all, and I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here, the PBMs cannot keep that money. And it sounds like I'm taking up for the PBMs. I'm really not. As when I walked in earlier, Senator Michelle asked who I was, and if I was from the PBM, I said, no, I'm one of the good guys. I don't mean that to disparage the PBMs in any way, but that's the truth. The DR fees or the clawbacks cannot be kept by the PBM. It goes to the MCO. The MCO being the insurance company or the parent company. Now, if you read between the lines of me saying that and what Ms. Khan said, that means that in the case of Medco being the PBM, then Optum would be the MCO. They would get the money, but it's like taking this cough drop I have in my right pocket, put it in my left pocket, and it's the same deal. I still got it. So it goes through the MCO is the one that keeps the DR fees. When we say clawbacks in terms of pharmacy, what we're really talking about, more so than the DR fees, are things where the patient comes in and you would give me a prescription for generic amoxil. And when you gave me that amoxil, I charge you $15, that's your copay. The clawback that most states are talking about would be where the PBM itself would then reduce that amount. So the PBM had nothing to do with that at all. You paid me the $15, but then they would reduce our payment on something else because all they were going to pay is $2. So they would reduce our payment by $13 and they would take that back. Now, what Cheryl was talking about at Funderburk's is a DR, so it's a little bit different. Clawbacks DR fees are a part of clawbacks, just to make sure we're all on the same page here. That last slide, were you able to pull it up? Okay, she doesn't have it, but that last slide she showed you guys, I want to make sure you understand that. She was talking about insulin, and she was talking about a state being able to go in, go in and make a contract with the PBMs and bid them, with the drug manufacturers and bid it out. The question I have about that is, isn't that what the PBM is supposed to be doing on the state's behalf? They're supposed to be doing those things. Yet what we've seen in recent history over the last 20 years is medicine going up, 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 up. It's not going down. And I'll share some numbers with you of my own that'll show, or I hope to show, that it's not going in one place. I don't envy you guys sitting here. First of all, you just had to sit through a presentation, very informative, but it's about things that you may not be up on. AWP, MAC, FUL, NADAC. I'm sitting up here and I'm going to tell you that we're not getting a good end of this deal. You'll have the manufacturers here next and they'll tell you they're not getting a good end of this deal. And then tomorrow you'll have PCMA here and the PBMs will say they're not getting a good deal. So you don't know which way to go on this. And I do appreciate you guys' attentiveness and I appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you about this. I want to tell you a little bit about me. I don't have that much time and I want to leave it for questions if you have any. I graduated from pharmacy school in 1997. I worked for Dykett Drugs in Laurel, Mississippi. Went in there in the summer to be an intern and I started working there as a pharmacy tech because I had to get hours. Got married, went to work for Super D Drugs. If you guys from Jackson remember that, Super D was a great company. When I got married, moved to McGee, Mississippi. You know where that is. McGee, Mississippi, and went to work for Eckerd Drugs. Eckerd Drugs is now defunct because CVS has bought them. In 2000, I had probably the greatest privilege of my life. And when I had my first child, not me, my wife, had our first child. And my wife told me, you can't do this anymore. You can't work from 8 o'clock to 8 o'clock all over the place every day. You got to be at home. So I went back to work at Dykett Drugs in 2000. Over that 7-year period before I bought the store, I had the opportunity to get to know and love each and every person that came in that drugstore. 2007, Ed Dykett, my mentor and probably one of my heroes in this world because he did a tremendous job for Laurel and for his patients. He decided to sell it and he gave me an opportunity to buy it, and I did. I took that store over in 2007. We were right across the street, if you've ever been to Laurel, from South Central Regional Medical Center. We did about 150 prescriptions a day. We kept growing and growing and growing because I believed in all my heart, and I still believe in my heart, if you do a good job and you're nice to people and you take care of people, more people will come. And with more people, more money would come. That happened. We got busier and busier and busier. So busy that The little drugstore we were in across from the hospital was 1,100 square feet. We couldn't stay there. We had people wrapped around the building trying to go. So I found another building. It was close and ended up buying it when, at the height of that store, we were doing about 1,700 prescriptions a day, which is a lot in our industry. So I did what I was supposed to do. I was good to my people, and forgive me if I get emotional because I don't want to, but this is important. I did what I was supposed to do, and I took care of my people, and it grew from 4 people working together to 25 people. And today is August the 29th, 3 years ago today, and this by no mistake, I mean, it's a mistake, it happened, or it's an accident. 3 years ago to this day, I had to tell 25 people that work for me that you no longer have a job because we can't make it. In this system that we have right now with DIR fees, you talked about it and you said Funderburk's paid $113,000. I think I played close to $350,000 that year. For no reason. I mean, the reason that they say that we have to pay that is because people don't take their medication. So we have to meet 85%. If you're a diabetic and you take anything, if you're not on a statin drug, for some reason for your cholesterol, it's our fault, we get penalized. If you're on blood pressure medicine and you don't get it every 33 days, we get penalized. We have to make sure all these things happen. So it's a hard industry. And again, you're looking at me saying it's somebody's fault. Tomorrow it's going to be somebody else saying it's somebody else's fault. I don't envy you. One more time. I'm going to get away from Dykett drugs and go to real numbers. This is not a national average. This is not anything. This is a store right here. I'll be glad to share this with you. I'm not going to share the store's name. If you would like to know that, ask me personally. They asked me not to share it because they didn't want any repercussions. And you said, well, what repercussions? I'm sure somebody hears from the Pbms. And if I give them this name, then boom, they could be there. This is an average pharmacy store. These are honest to goodness, real numbers that I went into their store and pulled it. This is in the month of July. They had $391,000 in sales. Okay, total. They did 6,951 prescriptions. So if you average that out, it's probably about 250 prescriptions a day, which is a lot. Well, it's a little more than average, but it is a lot for the type of help that they have. Gross profits, you're not going to hear this from anybody else that you talk about because this is true. The gross profit for those drugs on the $391,000 was $58,696. That equilibrates to 14.98%. So for those of you who know business, and I know you all do, that means you have 14 or 15% to pay all your expenses. 15% to pay your expenses. A really good pharmacy, the numbers are 12% in your labor costs, 12%. So if you take 12 from 15, you got 3% left. Now, 3% to pay the light bill, to pay debt, to pay your line of credit, which is another form of debt, to pay your cable bill, to pay your drug packaging bill. I mean, it's very minuscule how much pharmacies make in today's time. There are outliers that do really well. Don't get me wrong. There are drugs that we do really well on, and there are drugs that we do very poorly on. You talked about insulin. I never in a pharmacy, you can ask any independent pharmacy in the state of Mississippi right now, would you want to fill an insulin prescription? The answer to that is no. I don't want to use an expletive, but they would say another word before the no. That costs us $1,000. That's what it costs. The AWP on one, maybe $1,000. It costs us $900. We get reimbursed $870. They pay us 10 to 14 days from now, and we have to pay our wholesaler the $900, and they only paid us $870. I said that, and that's true. No question. Here's another interesting thing. Of the 6,951 claims that this pharmacy filled in the month of July, 1,075 they filled for negative reimbursements. In other words, the PBM paid us, the pharmacy, less than what we paid for it. That is 15.47% of the claims that we send through, we lose money on. That's no joke. It's the truth. The $4 plan from Walmart, does everybody remember that? When it first came out, it was the greatest thing ever since sliced bread. You can get generics for $4. That particular pharmacy filled 1,656 prescriptions less than $4. That's 23.82% that pharmacy filled, less than $4. Here's another alarming statistic for you. 156 of those prescriptions were for less than $1. Is what they paid us. PBM had nothing to do with it. That's what the patient ended up paying us. Those are real numbers. That's not exaggerated, excuse me, in any way, shape, or form. These are true. Again, if you'd like to, I'll take you to this store and we can look at it. Now, you may hear, well, you get a rebate. Yes, we do get a rebate. There's no question. It would probably add another 2% to this gross profit. I say all that to say independent pharmacists, not just in Mississippi, but across the nation, are hurting. They really are. Is it your responsibility to make sure we're okay? No, it's not. But it is your responsibility to make sure that the citizens of the state of Mississippi are okay. You're losing pharmacies here. In the Delta, I know, I don't want to call anybody's name, but I will. Guy Phillips. He owns 13 pharmacies across North Mississippi. A lot of them are in the Delta. He's having to shut down. I know he shut down too. It's going to get worse. He's telling me I need to wrap up, so I'm going to wrap up. Thank you guys so much for allowing me to come talk. Robert has my contact information. Any of this stuff, I'll be glad to give to you or go over it. Thank you.
Trey, will you take some questions, please?
I will certainly do so.
Okay, the chair has a question. Are you of the opinion that these larger PBMs are steering business to larger or bigger retailers?
Yes.
Okay. Now, with that being said, how do you explain, and we as policymakers and senators and representatives, we cannot get information and numbers from the private sector. We can only get numbers and statistics dealing with the state health insurance plan. You understand that?
Certainly.
Okay, with that being said, Trey, the top 3 or 4 largest pharmaceutical retailers in the state in terms of gross sales are, guess what? Independent pharmacists. So how would you explain that?
Say that one more time. I don't know that you're correct on it.
Within the context of the state health insurance plan, your 3 or 4 largest retailers in terms of gross sales are independent pharmacists.
Would those be specialty pharmacies?
That I don't know.
Yeah, I think if you go and look, that's what you'll find, that those are specialty pharmacies. That's making up a larger and larger portion.
And I hate to interrupt you, but what do you mean? What do you mean by a specialist independent pharmacist?
Well, there are independent pharmacies who do nothing but specialty drugs. There's 2 in Jackson I can think of, and I think there's 1 in Hattiesburg, and probably 1 in North Mississippi. As I said, specialty drugs are making up more and more of, it's almost tied with brand name drugs as far as your drug spend. So if one of those pharmacies, and you give me the name, don't do it right now, but if you would like to give Robert the name, I'll tell you if they're specialty, but I would 100% think that they would be. Okay. Now, to answer your other question, the state's biggest client would be an independent pharmacy. Well, I'm going to be honest with you on that because we do a freaking better job. Independent pharmacist does a whole lot better job than the chain pharmacy. I'm not talking bad about chain pharmacists. They do a tremendous job. So please don't say that. What I'm saying is it mattered to me whether you came in my drugstore, if you're a customer. It mattered to me if you came in, if you were okay. They do a lot better job in making sure that their patients are taken care of, not just in the store, but outside. So it doesn't surprise me that the busiest would be. Sorry.
If you were king for a day, what recommendation would you make to reduce pharmaceutical costs?
What I would really do is something that she talked about, and that would be transparency. Transparency using the NADAC model. I know it was tried to get passed here last year. NADAC stands for National Average Drug Acquisition Cost, and it is no more than what pharmacies pay for it plus a fee. I think what the state of Mississippi, or what the pharmacists were asking for, is $10.91 or $11.29. $11.29. We give it to you for cost. Pharmacist, let me give it to you for my cost, and you give me $11. Is that okay? For me to make sure that your health is okay? Is that okay for you to come in on the Paxlovid, but we find out you're taking an anti-rejection medicine, and so we don't kill you? It's worth that. It's worth $11.29 for us to have to pay a pharmacist, pay a technician, all those things. It is worth $11.29. I'm not here to argue. You asked me a question, and light and transparency is the best disinfectant of all. The other thing is monitoring. She's talking about something and does a tremendous job on the front end, on the contracting end. The next time the state of Mississippi goes in and does a new contract with whoever you decide to do, you do need to go with a company like her to look at this. You don't need to go with a healthcare exchange or something like that. Don't do that. You make sure that these people have nothing to do with any PBM. Make sure it's better for the state of Mississippi. So if you're asking King for a day, light is the best disinfectant of all.
Any other questions for Trey? Okay, hearing none. Thank you, Trey. We appreciate your time. Very good presentation. The joint committee stands in recess for 2 minutes.
No.
Be short.
Great job. Thank you. I'm Richard Roberson, the Hospital Association. Very good information. Oh, that's good. Yeah. Well, we have to do that a lot with healthcare stuff. It's not something that's just everybody's deep in the weeds. Hey, how you doing? How are you? I'm good. Thanks. I mean,
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the Joint Insurance Committee hearing is back in order. Our next speaker is Mr. Roberson with the Mississippi Hospital Association. Richard, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the House and Senate. It's my privilege to be with you today. I'm Richard Roberson, Vice President for Policy and State Advocacy with the Mississippi Hospital Association. My grandfather told me that when someone asks you to play cards, make sure you pick a game that you know. So I'm going to spend about this much time on pharmacy, and we're going to talk about hospitals. So I hope that's going to be all right, because I think your previous speakers covered a lot of ground and plowed the soil pretty well for us on PBMs and pharmacy issues. I will mention to you just a couple of things, and they already touched on it, but you know, the challenges that the hospitals have had are numerous. As it relates to pharmacy, it's the under reimbursement. It's the clawback provisions, those surprise bills, you know, often that are unexpected that come in quarterly or at the end of a year, where you're having to repay money back. That's hard. That's really hard, especially in these times where it's just been difficult to budget. And then there's just been a significant amount of downward pressure from pharma on the 340B program. And the 340B program is a program that hospitals and other primarily rural providers have used to help provide some additional services, and it creates some additional streams of revenue, allows hospitals to provide low-cost drugs to beneficiaries, to patients that need it. There's been a lot of action in Washington over the last several years, a lot of attempts to shrink the 340B program or make cuts into it. It is a vital program. It's not necessarily something as a state legislature that you'll be able to do a significant amount of work on, but just to be aware of all these different pressures on the hospitals, and particularly with 340B, there's lots of different drivers of that program, but the pressures, the downward pressures to squeeze those payments does end up hurting service lines that hospitals are able to provide. We've got one significant health system that provides a lot of discounted or free cancer treatment services because of the margins that they're able to make on 340B. So it's a significant program that we really do need to make sure is preserved as best we can. So I did want to mention that as well. So now we're going to talk about the card game that I know a little bit more about. From a Mississippi hospital standpoint, what I wanted to talk to you about today, first off, are the costs involved. So this slide represents how Mississippi hospitals are doing compared to our region. Basically, I've tried to put the Southeastern Conference up here. We don't really count Missouri and Kentucky in the SEC a lot of times. So we've put the southern states in here that will show you how we are relative to the other states on our inpatient expenses. Mississippi is the lowest, not only in this region, and you can tell from this chart, it's not even close, but we're the lowest in the country on inpatient expenses. And I don't have a slide on this, but over the last couple of months, Leapfrog, which is a hospital survey quality ratings group, has rated Mississippi hospitals as the 18th in the country in terms of quality. So lowest cost on inpatient expenses, 18th in the country in quality. I'd say we're doing pretty good, and we appreciate the help the legislature provides to us in being able to do that. So when we talk about hospitals, cost is a concern, and it is becoming an additional concern. These are 2020 numbers. The cost since 2020 has continued to go up. These numbers will look different when we get all the information loaded in for 2021 and then obviously over time for 2022. But our problem in Mississippi is not holding the line on cost. We've managed to do a pretty good job on that, all things considered. Our problem and our challenges is revenue. And to the extent that our challenge is revenue, you got to wonder where does your revenue come from? Well, it comes from insurance. It comes primarily from Medicare in Mississippi, Medicaid, and commercial insurance. And when I say commercial insurance, that includes not just your Blue Cross Blue Shield or your United or your Aetna, some of your employer-sponsored health plans, or even the state plan. It also includes your exchange plans, the Ambetter plans, and other marketplace plans on the federal exchange. And you can see from this slide, the predominant payer, well, as we compare ourselves to some other states for payer days. And by that, it means, who is your predominant payer? What payer comprises the biggest cost or the biggest revenue source for the patients that you see? When you look at how Mississippi compares nationally, we're the third highest state in the country in terms of Medicare payer days. So Medicare is a significant payer in Mississippi, but we're kind of an outlier with the rest of the country in terms of how we rely as hospitals on Medicare for our payments and our source of revenue. Y'all know we don't negotiate with Medicare for rates. It's not even, previous speaker made some great comments about being able to negotiate contracts with Pbms and how difficult that can be. Well, you ain't met Medicare. So you don't really negotiate your payments with Medicare. You take what CMS will come up with in the reimbursement rate, but we're heavily dependent on Medicare as a payer in Mississippi. So the other thing that we probably have not done as good of a job sharing with y'all over the years, and partly is because we have not had the data really until recently and had good, reliable data, are what are those things that Mississippians come to our hospitals for? What are those diagnoses that are prevalent in our hospitals? What are we treating patients for? And then beyond that, who's paying for these services that we're providing? So when you look at our payments for inpatient and you look at the top diagnosis, and I know that print right there is incredibly bad on that screen. So when you look at what do we pay for in Mississippi, one of the significant and the predominant source of revenue and the predominant reasons for discharges and patients coming to the hospitals are births. We have over 34,000 babies born in Mississippi in calendar year 2021. And when you, this is going to be a duplicate slide, I think, coming up here. Yeah. So when you look at the births by payer source for calendar year 21, you'll notice that a little over 6,000 of those 34,000 births were paid for by Blue Cross Blue Shield in Mississippi. That will include payments under the state health plan. TRICARE is a little under 1,000. It's about 741. So there are a lot of military families in the state, a lot of babies born, particularly in the Columbus, Gulf Coast, areas where you have bigger military presence, Meridian. Other commercial payers are just under 3,000. So from a commercial payer standpoint, you've got roughly 9,000 babies born in the state out of the 34,000 that are paid for by commercial insurance. So the rest of all of those are paid for by Medicaid or one of the Medicaid managed care programs, or they're self-pay, which typically is no payment at all. It's broadly categorized as self-pay because every now and then you do have some folks that don't have insurance, but they will pay on their claim. But most of the time that self-pay number means no pay at all. So when you look at the numbers for Mississippi and you look at the percentages, it breaks down pretty close to this. About 18% of the babies born in Mississippi are paid for by Blue Cross Blue Shield. 2% is TRICARE, 8% is other forms of insurance. That includes your United commercial plans, other commercial payers, and your marketplace exchange plans. About 2.5% is Medicaid fee for service, 18% Magnolia Medicaid, 22% Molina Medicaid, 5% is self-pay, and 22% is United Medicaid. So Medicaid overall, if you comprise the Medicaid fee for service, you throw in the Medicaid managed care plans, and then you throw in a little bit of out-of-state Medicaid programs. We do from Alabama, Tennessee, Louisiana, Arkansas, some of our neighboring states. Every now and then, those patients will cross state lines, come to a Mississippi hospital, and that's where their baby will be born. About 66% of all the babies born are covered by some form of Medicaid. 65% in-state, 1% out-of-state, and then another 5% are self-pay. So over 70% of the babies born in the state of Mississippi are paid for by Medicaid, or hopefully you get something from the self-pay. That is a huge financial challenge, okay? The labor and delivery resources are expensive. If the baby is going into NICU services, that's a whole different level. So that's your pay. That's what your payer mix looks like for Medicaid, for babies in the state of Mississippi. 28% is a combination of commercial Blue Cross Blue Shield, including the state insurance plan, other commercial insurance payers, including the exchange plans, and then that small percentage of babies that are born and paid for by TRICARE or Champa's VA. So I wanted you to have an idea when we talk about the importance of babies, I know there's been a lot of discussion about extending postpartum care. That's not really this snapshot. This is the snapshot of those babies that are born in the state of Mississippi and who pays for them. And it's over $34,000 a year, and that's trended pretty consistent over time. And this payer mix, I suspect if I went back and did a 10 or 15 year analysis, well, 10 year for sure with the commercial plans and the marketplace plans and the Medicaid plans, it's going to look a lot like this. When I was at Medicaid 10 years ago, it was about 65 to 70% every year of the babies born in Mississippi were paid for by Medicaid. So when you look at some of the other things that hospitals are doing and the reasons why patients are being admitted to hospitals, births are huge. Another big issue, these are the top 20 reasons why patients come into the hospital and the reasons for their admission and discharge. And another huge reason, number 2 on that deep blue, represents non-COVID related acute respiratory disease. Over the last few years, we've had to break down by code what's COVID and what's not. And this is the non-COVID related reasons for inpatients. And if you look at who's paying for those, it's primarily, as I know it's hard to say and I apologize, Medicare is going to be your number 1 payer for those patients. For non-COVID acute respiratory disease, Medicare is number 1, which is what you would expect for that population. Number 2 is Blue Cross Blue Shield. And again, that's a cross section of a variety. It's including the state health plan and such. Number 3 would be other forms of commercial insurance. Number 4 is Medicare Advantage, which we're able to break that out separately. So you don't even get to Medicaid among your top 4 payers for that disease state. Self-pay is number 5. So that's where that falls. So before you even get to what you are paying for in your Medicaid program for the number 2 reason why patients are coming into the hospitals under your Medicaid program, you've gone through 5 payer sources before you even get down to coming up with Medicaid. You don't get to Medicaid until you start getting into the United and the in-state Medicaid, Magnolia and all that down at 7, 8, 9. So the main reason patients are coming into the hospitals, live births, and that is predominantly Medicaid. The second reason is this non-acute respiratory, non-COVID respiratory disease, and that's not Medicaid. So another huge reason why patients are coming into the hospital as inpatients, and y'all are familiar with this, we talk about it all the time, and unfortunately, Mississippi is among the worst in the country for heart disease. When you look at who are the payers for heart disease, it's primarily Medicare, and Medicare Advantage is number 2. Self-pay, which is typically the uncompensated care, is your 3rd biggest group of patients that come into the hospitals, your 3rd largest quote unquote payer source, which probably isn't really going to be a payer. Then you get to other forms of commercial insurance. You get to Blue Cross at 5th, So that's pretty far down. And then you start picking up with your in-state Medicaid and your Medicaid managed care plan. So again, Medicaid is not this population. The Medicaid patients are not prevalent for hospitals as it relates to heart disease coming in as inpatients. It's primarily the Medicare, Medicare Advantage, and third being your self-pay. Those are all, the self-pay is just a huge issue. There's a considerable amount of expense as an inpatient when you have someone come into the hospital for heart disease. And if your third highest reason for patients coming into the hospitals is related to heart disease, and that is your third highest source of payment being uncompensated care, that is a huge challenge on your hospitals to try to make that math work. So you're trying to stretch the dollars with Medicare and to some extent with other commercial payers. So let's shift over and talk about outpatient services, because what we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years is almost a virtual paradigm shift in how hospitals treat patients. You've gone from treating patients primarily in an inpatient setting, where maybe that's 60% of your patients are treated as inpatients and 60% of your revenue, to flipping that paradigm to now it's about 60% outpatient services or outpatient care. That number is reflected and has historically trended in that direction going back 10, 15 years. That's has a lot to do with the way care has been delivered. It's advances in technology, it's advances in treatment. If you have knee surgery, most of the time you're going home that day. A lot of patients now, unless you have some other acute care issues, you're going home that day for things that you may 10, 15, 20 years ago stayed 2-3 nights in a hospital for, to make sure that you're okay and to provide you the care that you need. So, as those surgeries are performed more on an outpatient basis, those patients now go home. It's an outpatient procedure. You're not having extended stays. So a lot of the outpatient numbers and the reasons for these discharges and the way they come to us, it's a lot through the ER, okay? So one of the principal diagnoses and the things that they're providing in hospitals on an outpatient basis, the number one diagnosis are folks coming in and needing mammogram services. It's the breast cancer mammogram screenings for women that are either referred to the hospital for MRIs, for the diagnostic procedures that are being done as an outpatient department of the hospital, or they're coming in with things in a more acute setting and stuff is having to happen more immediately. So the payer sources for mammograms in Mississippi, it's Medicare, again, number one, followed very closely by Blue Cross Blue Shield and other commercial payers, and then the Medicare Advantage plans. And then you'll see the Medicaid managed care plans coming in 5th, 6th, 7th. So again, your Medicaid spend for the hospitals on outpatient mammograms, it's not even close to comparing. When you add all the Medicaid dollars up on this, it doesn't even come close to any one of your primary payers for mammogram services, and that is the primary diagnosis code for outpatient hospital. So going back to this, skip down, I told you just a second ago, non-acute respiratory, non-COVID respiratory was a huge part of the inpatient mix. It's also a huge part of the outpatient mix. And the numbers pretty much reflect that. I mean, if they're coming in for an outpatient and it's a respiratory distress situation, they're more than likely, a lot of them are getting admitted. And so the payer sources look similar. So jumping to the third greatest reason for outpatient discharges, the reason why patients come and the diagnosis associated with that is hypertension. Again, that's no surprise to us in Mississippi. Heart disease, hypertension, we are right there. We do it great. Unfortunately, we're again one of the top states for that as well. And so who's paying for hypertension services in the state of Mississippi? Again, it's Medicare, followed by Blue Cross Blue Shield, and then other commercial payers, and then the Medicare Advantage plans. And then followed by that, it's self-pay. Primarily, these are coming in through your emergency department. Is going to be your first encounter, and then you get into the Medicaid plan payments. So Medicaid, again, is not driving the payments to hospitals for these reasons. It's primarily from the Medicaid side, the primary driver is going to be the burst. And then I didn't prepare a slide on this today, but we can get you the data on it. The other big reason is typically going to be mental and behavioral health reasons is what Medicaid's paying for in a lot of hospital settings. So again, hypertension. And then the last slide I'll share with you on this is if you skip down and kind of look through different things, one of the items that jumped out to me that I was surprised by, because frankly, I expected more of that to be Medicaid related and Medicare, but it was not. If you look down at the 13th of the top 20 reasons, there's a general category that's kind of unspecified headaches. The patient presents typically in the emergency department is where we're seeing this, with just an unspecified headache, no explanation right out of the gate for it. So you start running batteries of tests. And who gets billed the most for that in the state of Mississippi is Blue Cross Blue Shield and other commercial insurance payers. So that particular kind of catch-all bucket is typically getting billed and paid for on an outpatient basis by Blue Cross Blue Shield and your other commercial plans. Again, including your exchange plans, the Ambetter products and such that are available on the federal exchange. But the third highest number, and it's right there with other commercial insurance, is self-pay. That's something our hospitals tell us anecdotally, and the evidence from our claims data that we're able to gather bears that out, is a lot of the ER patients, a lot of the patients that are coming in are presenting for general head pain. What we've learned over the last several years, especially 10, 15 years ago, was a lot of that was opioid driven. Folks coming in looking for pain medicine of any sort to just alleviate that. So they would come in presenting with some type of ache or pain, and it was opioid driven. That's not still the case as it was, but there's still some of that too. But again, that's a huge issue for the self-pay. And then number 4 is Medicare, and then you start getting into your Medicaid products. So I just wanted to share that information and again, give you a flavor of the things as your insurance committees are working through these issues. I want to try to paint a picture for you of the things that our hospitals are seeing patient-wise, what the patients are presenting with in an inpatient setting and in an outpatient setting, and who is paying for those services. Again, the challenge from the hospital perspective is we're holding the line on cost better than any other hospital group in the country. We're number 1. And if you break it down in detail, our community hospitals, publicly owned hospitals are the lowest. Our nonprofits are, I think, the 6th lowest, and our for-profits are like the 8th or 9th lowest. So across the board, Mississippi hospitals are holding the line on cost. But these type of payer dynamics and challenges are creating revenue pressures that are making it extremely difficult. Negotiating with Medicare is not really an option. Similarly with Medicaid, those are government payers. They set the price, and they're having to meet certain qualifications when they do that. And then trying to negotiate with private commercial payers puts pressure on both the Blue Crosses of the world or your commercial insurance companies, and on the payer to try to come up with a price point that satisfies the needs of the insurance carrier, so that they're trying to keep their premiums low for their customers, and for those hospitals, in our case, that are trying to generate the revenue that they need. So I wanted to give you that flavor. I'm glad to talk about those, and we'll be glad to come back to the committee and present other data points and kind of walk through more detail as y'all would like. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Are you going to talk about gold card and prior authorization?
Yeah, I can.
Can you do that in about 5 minutes?
I sure can. So some of the things that we've talked about with y'all over the last couple of years, one of the things in particular is a gold card process. What we've seen from the provider side, and it's not just hospitals, it's doctors, it's clinics, heck, even pharmacy. Anytime a provider has to request a prior authorization for a service that they render to a patient and that they deem medically necessary to a patient, there is a cost involved in that. Typically, clinics, hospitals, pharmacy, they're going to have staff that may be pretty much all they do is take the information, ask the insurance carrier for a prior authorization. Without that prior authorization, the claims are going to deny. And the patients probably aren't going to get the service if the insurance company denies it. And then you start these loops of how can you get the service that's going to get paid for. So what we've talked about with the legislature over the last couple of years is doing something similar to what they've done in Texas, which is a gold card prior authorization process, so that if you are a provider who typically gets 95, 96, 97, whatever high percentage benchmark you would like to set, of your request authorized. You're not someone who is just kind of throwing something out and seeing what sticks to the wall, but you're a provider that consistently gets nearly all of their authorizations approved. We'd like to set up a process similar to what they've done in Texas, and what they just issued today, I believe their regulations from their Department of Insurance on, is a gold, what they call a gold card prior authorization status, to try to eliminate some of that additional administrative costs for providers and apply that to all insurance products in the state, so that you can have some efficiencies and some reduction in administrative cost for things that the providers typically are going to do. Now, that process would not just be an open the floodgate. It would involve retroactive reviews by the carrier to make sure that when they go back and look at those claims, what the provider said was needed was actually needed. So you may get some expedited treatment on the front end, but if on the back end on the review, it says, well, no, that's not, that wasn't legit, we can go back and carve that or claw that back. So it's not just opening the floodgate. It would have to be carefully managed. We got to find the sweet spot on what percentage works. For some treatments and some procedures, it may be 99%. For other treatments and other procedures, it may be something else. It may vary by type of service for that provider. So you may be a provider that sees a significant number of one thing, and we're going to gold card you for that, but we're not going to gold card you for these other things because you really don't have a history of prescribing that or ordering that very often. So I think it's something we could look at. It's a way to save on the administrative cost. Other studies through the years have shown that typically for a physician's office, they'll spend upwards of $100,000 a year for basically what you're doing is chasing claims payments on the prior authorization side, and then on the back side trying to get claims paid. So we think there's a cost savings that hopefully can then get passed on to the consumer through that process and expedite the provision of care to those who actually need it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Richard. Quick question from the chair. The state health insurance plan and Blue Cross Blue Shield, compared to your other private insurance companies, have a very small number of PA requirements, prior authorizations. So if we take up some type of gold card enabling legislation, are we really making a difference? Are we accomplishing something with those two entities having a small number of PA requirements?
Yeah, I think you are, because any dollar saved is going to be important, whether we're talking about 5 million or 50 million. It all matters and it all adds up. I think the primary issue that many of the providers I've talked to will tell you have been challenges are when you deal with the Medicaid managed care plans or the Medicare Advantage plans. The Medicare Advantage plans in particular have been extremely challenging. I probably get more calls from my hospitals about those plans than anything. So if there's some ways to streamline that process, I think that would be well worth the effort.
You said Medicare, not Medicaid, correct?
Medicare Advantage, and then also the Medicaid managed care.
Well, with Medicare, we would not have any jurisdiction over any type of Medicare.
State is able to do some things on the Medicare Advantage plan. It's not as broad as other policies or other folks that are licensed or regulated by the state. I think we need to look at that and see if there is something to do, let's do it.
Okay, will you take questions? Okay, Senator from Madison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you began, you were talking about I guess the clawbacks as related to medicine for the hospitals. My question to you is, I always get from constituents who have been hospitalized that an aspirin or Tylenol can cost an exorbitant amount of dollars. So what causes that in a hospital setting?
It's the purchasing price for the hospital through whatever purchasing group they're getting. That drives it up, and then just the add-on trying to get a margin from the pricing for the hospital as well. It's all factored into that, so it depends on the hospital, and a lot of it goes back to whether it's a PBM they're buying it from or a group purchasing contract, but that's typically where it's going to come from, is those pass-through costs. And a lot of times the hospitals aren't able to negotiate significantly lower rates. And then sometimes there's maybe a markup for something that pays for something else as well.
So what would be the difference in getting it from an independent pharmacist or CVS and the hospital?
Well, so if patients come in with their drugs that they're taking anyway, those can be administered in a hospital setting. If it's a new drug that they're getting in the hospital or IV fluids that are getting administered, that's going to be something different.
No, I'm
So-
not talking about IVs. I understand that. They're always talking about an aspirin. That's
Right.
a
Yeah, Tylenol.
typical one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
$4 per pill for a Tylenol or something like
Right.
that. Yeah. And I don't know if the hospitals are breaking it down. Like, I know that used to be an issue. I don't know if they're still breaking it down like that anymore. They tend to be bundled up by the diagnosis code as opposed to the pill, but we can look at that and see.
Thank you.
Madam Representative from Jones.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, Mr. Roberson, for the presentation. I want to go back to these slides that you had on the major discharges. First, I wanted to ask you, you said that 66% of these 32,000 births were paid by Medicaid. Were not any of those births paid for by CHIPS, or did you include CHIPS in that?
Now, the CHIP payment, the CHIP would be for the child's insurance, but the labor and delivery costs will be tied to the
Okay,
mom.
I didn't know that. And so
Mom would be on Medicaid or one of the Medicaid managed care plans, and that would cover the mom's, the one that triggers the payment.
okay, so we have a program called CHIPS, but we're doing two different things with CHIPS, when we could really just be doing one thing with Medicaid, really.
I'm not sure. So, they're separate programs with similar
Exactly.
benefit instructions, right?
But
There's-
if 66% of Medicaid is births and the CHIPS mother has to be on Medicaid, and you and I both know that the Medicaid program gives better benefits than the CHIPS program. I don't understand that from an insurance point of view, Mr. Chairman, that a child who's on Medicaid gets more benefits cheaper than they do on the CHIPS program. Now, the second thing I wanted to ask you, Mr. Roberson, is on the self-pay. That was very interesting, because I think you were trying to make another point to us. And I'm gonna see if this is the point you were trying to make. You told us that heart disease is number 3 in self-pay. And you told the committee, basically the hospitals get 0 for that. If somebody's trying to pay 10 or 15 or $20 a month, you appreciate it. But basically you're eating that. You're getting nothing from that. That is not technically uncompensated. That's what you call free charity, right?
Pretty close.
Okay, and then you went to hypertension, and you told us that in hypertension, that there was a significant amount of self-pay. You look at your chart, that there was a significant amount of self-pay in hypertension. Is that not correct?
That's true.
And then you did took us to another area that you talked about self-pay. And then one area that really concerned me was the negative insurance situation with mammograms in the state. So if the hospital association could be king for a day, somebody said that a while ago, would the hospital association's position not be to, since the heart condition people, that's only number 3 because of Medicare, then we know that we're talking about a certain age of people. And then the same thing with hypertension. Would it be the hospital's position that if you were to expand the Medicaid program to take people 65 and younger, that you could intercede and the hospitals would then get paid and not lose those dollars, and that women could get this needed care and not have to be, like me, thank God today, a breast cancer survivor. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. So I can't see that slide. On the mammograms, that's an outpatient claim. That's the highest principal diagnosis, and that's the primary diagnosis or the primary service, if you want to think about it like that.
But we don't, it's not being paid for a significant number of women in the state, right?
That's correct. So the primary payer sources for mammograms, for example, for our hospitals. Now, this does not include other providers of that service, okay? But for hospitals, it's Medicare, followed by Blue Cross and other commercial insurance, and then Medicare Advantage, and then you get into the Medicaid plans. You got to go down about 8 payers, I think, or 9, before you get to self-pay for mammograms. So that's just not a service that's being accessed in the hospital setting by uninsured Mississippians.
But from an insurance standpoint, those first 4 or 5 insurance payers would be the same thing that you would see in clinics, that you would see other places that women would go to try to get this service, right?
Very possible.
And so you would see that same thing in your other chart that you were showing on heart disease as well as hypertension, right?
That's right. So
if you were king for the day and you could, it would make more sense for you to be able to get paid, right? And there is a way that you can get paid because these people would fit into that category of less than 65. In essence, it would be an intervention. And so to expand the Medicaid program would be a sensible recommendation, I think, that the hospitals would probably be in favor of, right?
that's right. What we know from this slide right here on hypertension on an outpatient basis, self-pay, the number of beneficiaries that are coming for primary hypertension related disease is behind Medicare, Blue Cross, other commercial plans, Medicare Advantage, and then you get to self-pay before you get to Medicaid. So a large number of those self-pay individuals would most likely be eligible for Medicaid expansion. Okay, so if you had that, then you would have a revenue source for those individuals, for hospitals. And hopefully, this is an outpatient, primarily a service, I would imagine. It's hard from our data to determine if that service was delivered in a clinic setting or delivered in the emergency department. Anecdotally, what we hear is this is a lot of the emergency department. So that's where you don't want patients continuing to access the system that have what you would say, that's a disease state that's going to be chronic. So you want to get them help outside of an ER setting.
And that is why you brought us the chart with Mississippi's payer days, because you wanted us to see basically where your revenue was coming from. And then, you all used to provide us with a number that would tell us what your uncompensated care was, which that shows even what the insurances do not pay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Representative from Rankin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roberson, thank you for being here today. Do you know what percentage of Mississippians would be eligible for Medicaid benefits?
The raw number, I think, is probably, if you looked at it today, is probably around 200,000.
200,000, and that's out of 3 million people. What does that come to? I guess I should do my math.
Traditionally, Mississippi, when we've looked at it before, it's fluctuated between 5 to 8% of the population.
So,
8% or
so 5 to 8% of the population is eligible for Medicaid, and yet 65% of births are paid for by Medicaid, according to your chart. So 34,000 babies born each year. And of the 5 to 8% of people who are eligible for Medicaid, 65% of them are covered by Medicaid, another 5% self-pay. Your
I
chart.
think I misunderstood I thought you were asking about the expansion population.
No.
The number of people on Medicaid, I
Yes.
think is around 700.
700,000. Okay, that's more
Yes,
like
sir.
it.
I'm sorry. I misunderstood your question.
Okay,
Yeah.
that was throwing me off.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
The slide that you showed us, was that for an annual number?
That was for
as
calendar year 2021.
2021. And during the last 2 years, postpartum has been extended to 12 months during the COVID pandemic. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so that chart would reflect the fact that 12 months of postpartum were being covered. Is that right?
They would have been counted, and that's probably, I would venture to say that's probably within that 2.5% of the Medicaid fee for service, because I think that's where those people have been.
And even with the extension to 12 months, you still got a 5% self-pay or no pay, even with that extension.
That's right.
How does that compare to the numbers prior to the extension to 12 months postpartum when it was still 2 months? How does that compare with the number of those that were births that were paid by Medicaid versus self-pay versus private insurance?
So it's a small percentage of those eligible females who go on to the Medicaid program under the pregnant women category, 185% of the federal poverty level, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the ladies who are staying on through the extended postpartum coverage. And within that 12-month period, we know that not many of them, a very, very small percentage, have another labor and delivery associated for that person. But there are some that do have that, and those who do typically are going to be at a higher risk for a preterm delivery or complications. So the number is, if you looked at historically at the number of births in Mississippi that Medicaid has paid for, it has been 65 to 70% for years. And that's just historical data. It's not a substantial amount. That postpartum extension is not, it's important to capture what will probably be a very expensive labor and delivery if it happens within that 12 months for that lady who's already on. It's more prevalent, the services that extension provides that lady are most likely to be related to other things that happen for her. Mental and behavioral health issues being one that other states, I think, have seen a need for, and then other things that just come up like they do for everyone else.
So just want to be clear, extending from 2 months to 12 months, I mean, at 2 months, you're still covering the birth. Is that correct?
The birth would have been paid for
The birth
2
is
months
paid
earlier.
2 months
Yes, sir.
earlier, and then you got 2 months. And so, and how many women are we talking about that would fall into this, that would be in this category if we were to change it from 2 to 12 months?
I don't know what the Medicaid data is for that.
I mean, I've heard the number is like $7 million, but I haven't heard the number of women that it would help. And I'd be interested in knowing that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative. Last question, Madam Senator from Lafayette.
Just for informational purposes, the postpartum care that we're talking about is by and large going to happen in the doctor's offices and not actually at the hospital setting. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that was quick. Any other questions? We got time for one more. Lady from Pearl River.
Thank you. It's always good to see you and have you here with us. Just a quick question. Is there, or do you know the percentage that Medicaid reimburses for versus private insurance? Because I've always been told by different hospital administrators and people in the past that Medicaid didn't really pay anything, but we're sitting here talking about expanding Medicaid. So if the reimbursement isn't great, how does that benefit the hospital?
So that's a great question. And we've looked at cost data from Medicaid as it relates to a percent of cost. And the last numbers that I've seen, what Medicaid's reimbursing hospitals on an outpatient basis is close to 100% of their cost. Okay. And it varies by service. Some are going to be more, some will be less, but it's about 98%, I think, of cost. So we're doing a pretty good job of covering cost. Now, the pharmacist that spoke earlier talked about a margin of 15%. Hospitals would love to have a 15% margin. I think any business would love to. In hospitals, the margin is much smaller on average, but for outpatient, it's typically around 98%. For the inpatient payments, those inpatient claims payments that are coming out from Medicaid, and I'm including the managed care companies as well, it's typically about 56, 58% of cost. Then when you load in the supplemental payment programs and you factor in dish payments and the MHAP payments, and now we've kind of bifurcated that. It's not the way it used to be, but when you look at all the different claims payments, it brings that payment up above 100% of cost. Okay, I think maybe around 112% is one of the numbers I've seen. But then you have to back out what the hospitals pay in taxes to get that percentage. So over the last couple of years with COVID as an enhanced match from the federal government, it's been beneficial because the taxes that hospitals have paid have thankfully been lower because they hadn't had the funds to pay what they used to pay anyway. The concern is when that goes back and starts ramping up again, that it's going to decrease that cost percentage back below 100%. So by other comparisons in other states, admittedly, and I think other folks have testified to this, Mississippi Medicaid pays pretty well. Okay, I'm not going to tell you it doesn't. It's still typically going to be your lowest payer. And when you're seeing the payment distribution and the payer sources for many of these things that I talked about, when you get down the list, Medicaid is 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th in the payer groups. But for labor and delivery, it is number one by and far. So we've got to make sure we're covering that very well because our kids depend on that too.
Okay, Richard, thank you so much for your time and presentation. This meeting is hereby adjourned until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.